The Alberta election is less than a week away now. The latest polls say it's been a tight race between the UCP and the NDP. The UCP does, however, have a slim lead over Rachel Notley's New Democrats. There's still around 18% of voters who are undecided. Now, to chat more about the upcoming election is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, what will it take for both Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley to sway over the 18% of undecided voters?
Yeah, it's a great question because why aren't those people decided? What are the issues that they're looking for? What are the things that they are uncertain about? There's a couple possible explanations there. One of them is that you had people who sort of voted for, say, Rachel Notley and Stephen Harper in 2015. Maybe in 2019 they voted for Jason Kenney, but maybe they cast their ballot for one of Justin Trudeau's candidates. So you have this sort of situation where certainly the UCP, I think more so than the NDP, has a cohort of people who have voted for them in the past, but are not wildly enthusiastic voters. They're not card-carrying UCP members. They're maybe sort of more progressive conservative types, economically conservative, but quite socially liberal. So I think that's probably one of the things you have going on here is they're kind of looking at Danielle Smith in particular as leader, and they're maybe not so sure about her, but they're not so sure about the NDP's policies in general. So it is a very strange situation, right? We're a week out, and we have like as many as 1/5 of Alberta voters who aren't sure who they're going to cast a ballot for. So I think you're going to see them really sort of drilling down on their message, on the things that they're polling. Their focus group shows that Albertans care about. If I had to speculate, it would be that the NDP is going to keep talking about healthcare and the UCP is going to keep talking about the economy. But very much those people are in play, right? With such a close election, with Calgary as a battleground, that many people certainly could make the difference if they if they make up their minds by Monday.
The Ethics Commissioner released a report on Danielle Smith's conduct regarding Calgary street preacher Arthur Pawlowski. Tyler, apparently it wasn't the call so much to him that broke the rules, but rather it was a call she made to Tyler Shandro, who was the Justice Minister back then. But now the report also concluded that it found no evidence that Smith's office contacted the Crowns, which CBC had reported on. Would Smith potentially look at suing the CBC now?
She has hinted at that, yes. I don't believe she has committed to going forward with a lawsuit, but certainly has talked about it and has demanded a retraction and apology from CBC, which as yet has not happened. So it's sort of an interesting story because you're right, those are the two things that it found. It found that she violated the Conflicts of Interest Act and that the Ethics Commissioner could find no evidence of what CBC reported. Now, the UCP, of course, has seized upon the CBC angle to this story and has made very little mention of the other part of it, the Conflict of Interest Act violations, which incidentally, the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, Ethics Commissioner, I should say, compared to Justin Trudeau's actions during the SNC-Lavalin scandal, which Danielle Smith herself had condemned. So it's a bit of a messy situation there, I would say. But it doesn't seem to have really stuck. In the debate last week, Rachel Notley brought it up and Danielle Smith sort of brushed it off and talked instead about the CBC. I believe reporters asked Danielle Smith about it again after the debate, and she sort of avoided the question and then ended her press conference. So it was a bombshell that does not appear to have, really exploded perhaps as one might have expected.
Tyler, thank God for the cooler temperatures and rainy conditions in both central and northern Alberta. It's been a blessing in helping our firefighters battling the 80-plus wildfires across the province. More than 1 million hectares have burned already, and what the record was 1.3 million set back in 1981. Now, the wildfires have actually been a bit of a campaign and election issue. Can you explain?
They have been. Part of it is going back to this decision under the Kenney government where they scrapped sort of these rappel teams of elite firefighters who would rappel from helicopters down to fight blazes. And that team was scrapped to save money, but maybe three years ago now, probably. So that's been a little bit of a campaign issue. Certainly there was time sort of earlier on in the campaign when Danielle Smith was sort of stepping back from campaigning, putting her premier hat back on to meet with evacuees. And actually, both her and Notley met with evacuees together and sat down and had a discussion about how best to tackle the situation. Notley, of course, was premier during the 2016 fires in Fort McMurray. So it hasn't been as big an issue maybe as one would have expected. I think if we weren't in a campaign right now, this would certainly be pretty much all any of us were talking about. But it hasn't been a colossal campaign issue. And, I think there's the very logical reason for that of you don't want to politicize a tragedy unless there's a very good reason to do so. But, with the election next week and depending what happens with the fires, I think that'll be sort of job one in a lot of ways for whoever is the next premier.
Tyler, let's talk more about the approach the UCP and NDP have been taking on the campaign trail. You mentioned it earlier, the UCP focusing on the economy, while the NDP, it's been more about health care. What has been really resonating with voters? What do the polls suggest?
Well, it's interesting because the polls suggest that people who have made up their minds are more likely to vote for the United Conservatives. A couple percentage point difference, not a massive difference, but a difference. But they generally seem to like Rachel Notley more and trust Rachel Notley more. And you had a similar dynamic actually in the Kenney years. So to some extent, what Rachel Notley is talking about, healthcare being, I think that it's fair to say, the big one, is resonating in some way. However, the UCP is talking a lot more about the economy, and part of the challenge for Rachel Notley and the benefit for Danielle Smith, frankly, is that Danielle Smith doesn't have a record to run on. She's only been premier for 10 months or 8 months, something like that, right? And she came into office during relatively good economic times. So if Rachel Notley wants to attack her on the economy, well, she's really attacking Jason Kenney. Whereas Notley does have her 4 years in government from 2015 to 2019 that Danielle Smith can attack on. So I do think that the UCP line on the economy is resonating. And just to jump back a little bit to what we talked about at the beginning, these undecided voters and these sort of moderate voters, the Notley New Democrats actually have, I think, tried to reach out to them. A really good example of that being their promise to cut taxes for small businesses, and then sort of counterbalance that with a slight increase to the corporate tax. So that's not a particularly left-wing policy in some ways. You can imagine the UCP having that been their policy to help small business owners. So there's some fight over the people in the middle. Their messages, I think, are resonating, but the question is how far outside of the sort of people who already support them are those messages resonating?
Daniel Smith and the UCP talked about that, raising the corporate tax, that it'll be a job-killing initiative, and they've really gone all out attacking the NDP in that regard.
They have, yeah, and that's a really good example of them sort of seizing on something that they tend to be more trusted by Albertans on, which is the economy. I think the plan, so that Jason Kenney had cut it from 12 to 10 to 8%, and I believe Notley's New Democrats are promising to bring it back up to 11. So basically bring it back up to the level it was in 2020, or a little lower than 2020, I suppose. But yeah, that's a really good example of something that the UCP's polling shows that they are stronger on than the New Democrats, and they're going all in on it when they get the chance.
It's funny because you talked about having a track record with Rachel Notley, and the UCP is also attacking Rachel Notley because they say she had a terrible track record. And they're reminding Albertans about that track record. Do you think that track record, that past history that Notley has with Albertans is going to really maybe hurt her in the polls?
It might. I think it depends what these undecided voters primarily are concerned about. I think that Rachel Notley had a really good few years. I think that's the last few years, I should say, have been really good for her. Being in opposition during the COVID-19 pandemic, it gave her party a lot of opportunities for fundraising, for proposing alternative policies, for holding the government to account, all the things an opposition is supposed to do. Right. And I think they most Albertans, or lots of Albertans, I should say, came out of the pandemic liking what they had said. There was a lot of polling there for a while that showed the NDP was up on the United Conservatives. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. She does have that record, and she was in power during a time that the economy was doing poorly, partially her fault, partially just the vagaries of an international economy. But that is a record that she's had to wear. In the same way that, some of Danielle Smith's past statements have been things she's had to address. But, 2015 is a long time ago now, but there's absolutely no doubt that the legacy of those years are lingering over this campaign.
Now, there are other parties running this election, including the Alberta Party, the Alberta Liberal Party, and a bunch of independents. You say, however, that they really won't make much of a dent. It's really a two-party race, isn't it?
It is. We're looking, when you look at the overall polling, sort of the popular vote polling, they're maybe going to get 1%, 2%, 3% of the vote. Those are very, very small numbers, and I think unlikely to swing any ridings. There's a couple ridings that could be in play a little bit, but I wouldn't expect any of those parties to win a seat in the legislature, which makes it more or less, well, I think impossible for a minority government to come out of this. But yeah, really, when you look back on 2019, when the Alberta Party and the Alberta Liberals had candidates in the debate, very different landscape, very much a two-party race.
How about some of the ridings where famous UCP candidates, former ministers like Schweitzer and Taves and so forth, Savage, they're not running again. Are they really up for grabs, or do you think they will go back to the UCP?
I suspect they are more up for grabs than they would have been had those candidates still been around. That said, those ridings tend to be in more conservative parts of the province, so it seems reasonable to me that the candidates that have replaced them are in a pretty good position to run. But as we've talked about before, the NDP is putting a lot of effort into Calgary. Their Get Out the Vote campaign, their door-knocking strategy. So I think, I wouldn't say they're a toss-up necessarily, but it would not surprise me if the NDP picked up some of those ridings that have been vacated.
Now, speaking of Calgary, Tyler, let's talk some municipal politics for just a moment here. Calgary Mayor Jyoti Gondek has talked about potentially not allowing fireworks in the Stampede City on Canada Day. Why not?
Yeah, that's right. The argument seems to be that there are cultural sensitivities at play. It's the 100th anniversary of legislation that excluded Chinese immigration. There's the whole Truth and Reconciliation trend that's been going on for the last couple of years. And the argument is just that to celebrate sort of Canada and its legacy would be inappropriate at this time. But of course, many Calgarians do not feel that way, and there is a petition going to bring back the fireworks. So I suppose we'll have to see what happens at the municipal level. There were similar sort of spats over this last year. Winnipeg, I think, I can't remember if they canceled fireworks or if they sort of canceled Canada Day celebrations and called them something else. But, it's not a particularly new thing in some ways. But, every time it's come up, it's been very, very controversial.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are very proud to be Canadians and want to celebrate Canada Day with the fireworks and everything. So, yeah, we'll see how that shakes down. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from our provincial capital in Edmonton.
Thanks, Hal.